Hi there. Welcome to Storytime. I'm Dr. Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. And because of that, I like to do this thing I call Storytime. And that is when it's just me. Storytime is me reading biblical passages that I just realized I need to take that banner down. I mean, it's nice, actually. Thank you to all my patrons, all the people who are patrons, who do help to make this happen. But right, so when it's just me, then story time is me reading a biblical passage or passages live with people here commenting or not and engaging with what I'm doing, and me offering what is essentially my kind of nothing held back engagement with the passage through the lenses that I engage scripture with, which would be through feminist lenses, materialist lenses, which means looking at how these biblical passages are enacted in our lives or in people's lives around us that impact us or impact society, impact policy, impact all kinds of things. I use post-colonial lenses, which means I'm reading for the economics and politics that were behind the texts, that were a part of influencing what ends up in the texts, what kinds of ideas and issues need to be addressed. And that also then applies to the way the tradition has interpreted these passages, often ignoring the politics. So then a day like today is necessary, which is today, last week, and next week, looking at the date here, next week, I'll be reading some stories that are attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, and reading them and engaging them through a lens that many people who grew up in a Christian tradition, at least, do not hear, which is through the lens of what's going on here politically and economically. Most people in most traditions, and this is not just conservative evangelicals, this is mainline denominations, tend to perpetuate spiritual meanings, a spiritual way of interpreting scripture, instead of the kind of feet on the ground political and economic issues, especially when it comes to Jesus. In the synoptic gospels, that is where we get, I think, the more human version of Jesus, the one who is angry about injustices, that's what gets him killed, all of that. Most people are taught to read all of that through a spiritualized lens rather than a economic. And so that means that that's what allowed Christianity to be adopted by the empire, right? By the Roman Empire, is our spiritualized meanings to the gospel, right? It's all about the afterlife, not about this life. Spiritualized meanings of his anger at economic injustice, right? You turn that into spiritual meaning, then it isn't critiquing exploitation. It isn't critiquing the political structure that exists, right? It's just something that we can all take as some sort of a spiritual message, right? And so that's what I did last week, and my slides that I think are helpful weren't ready last week, and so I'm actually going to do a quick brief summary of what I did talk about last week, and show you the slides as a way to do that. I think visuals are really helpful personally, pedagogically, all that stuff. And I don't know if I need to be paying attention to the comments. Somebody made some comment about Paul, and I'm like, and then there's the issue of Paul and his writings, and that's a whole different thing, actually, politically speaking, because he's very clear about engaging politics in the genuine writings, at least. So that's for another day. This, to me, is really fun because this is the guy Jesus, right? This is the guy that everybody needs if you're going to be Christian, or even if you're not a Christian anymore, but some people still like the guy Jesus, or think that he did something important and interesting. And so, yeah, it can be really, really helpful to see that, oh yeah, the stuff that he talked about, I think, is better understood when looked at through these lenses. And it kind of set me free, even though I wasn't necessarily still part of regular church gatherings. It was still helpful for me to be like, oh, see, I can get behind this guy, right? This guy's denouncing political and economic exploitation. Like, I'm down with that, right? I'm down with that message. So So I will do questions at the end, I think. I think there have been, from time to time, some questions about this stuff, which is great, and I love that there are people here present, chatting, and having a little thing going on, which is great. And so I'll kinda pause, when I'm done with what I'm trying to present, and then ask if there are any questions, and I'm still not to the point where I'm only asking for super chats because I'm trying to be open. But so this is where we're doing. This is what we're doing. Let's do a little bit of this. This is oh, sorry. I just need to bring it on the stage with me. So this is what we read through last week, or part of what we read through last week during story time. Oh, I didn't clarify. Right. So jumping around as I sometimes do. So I said when it's just me, story time is about the Bible, biblical passages. And then when I bring a scholar on, which is what I started doing this month, then the story time part is about them, their story, who they are, why who they are is important to what they do. And so I have two things in mind that I'm trying to do with this. One is I think it's really helpful for people to see that scholars, so people who get to the place of being scholar, and you're like doing PhD work and all that, have very similar stories to a lot of you. And or at least they're like the story, hearing about it, and then hearing about the fact that that inspired them to do what I think is really kind of transformative work. That I think that's just helpful for all of us to know that's going on. The second thing is I am aware, very keenly aware of there being, kind of a slate of public biblical scholars, also public scholars of religion in general, but I'm a biblical scholar. And the handful of typical people are great people, right? They're doing, they have important content. But I think there are other not specifically public scholars who have some scholarship that I think is, accessible on a certain level. Or if not even, or if they're only really writing for academia, which there's a place for that. I'm not dissing that. That needs to happen to kind of make the field more diverse and more inclusive and more progressive, and so that's needed. But some of them, I think it's just helpful for you to know about more biblical scholars who are doing progressive work and are trying to make the world a better place in that way, right? So I kind of want to expand your repertoire in terms of who you know of, or who you've heard of at least. And so there's that. That's also what part of my motivation here. The next scholar I'm going to have on is Adele Reinhartz, and she is a Jewish woman who is a New Testament scholar, which is highly unusual. She's also the first female scholar of the New Testament who is Jewish to be the president of the global society, the Society of Biblical Literature. Kind of an interesting moment. She was just, I think it was 2021. She was the president of that society. Kind of a big deal, right? For it to be a woman, there've only been 11. And then she's also Jewish and in the Newer Testament field. Like, that's very rare to have Jewish people who are New Testament scholars. And also very helpful to have them. So anyway, yes, it is an awesome accomplishment. And it's beautiful in my mind that she was endorsed at that position. So anyway, so she's the next scholar we have coming on in a couple weeks. So today we're doing this, and let me just review briefly. Luke 20:9-19 is that parable, right, where a man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants and went away to a country for a long time. And when the season came, right, he said, blah, 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 blah. So if you want to go maybe read it later on your own, if you weren't here for it, go watch the video, whatever. But this is a visual of why this kind of a reading is so important to me. So what I grew up hearing, and on a certain level, probably teaching others, right, is the more traditional rendering. And I grew up in a Methodist church, not super conservative, denomination as a whole. So, and I know that most of my friends, right, at seminary heard it the traditional way. And I, in fact, even in the year 2019 at University of Portland, which is a Catholic institution, there were still people teaching the traditional version, even though the traditional version is actually highly destructive, actually, and harmful to Jewish people. So it's kind of fascinating. Anyway, so let's look at this briefly. The story about there's a vineyard, the guy who owns it isn't nearby. He sends someone to collect his portion, right? And they won't give it to him. They won't give it to the people he sends. Then they decide to kill his son, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's the story. And so traditionally speaking, people turned it into a metaphor, a spiritual metaphor that I don't have in here the owner of the land. I left that out of the chart. Forgot about that. So that the owner, the man who planted a vineyard, is spiritualized as God instead of just being the man who owned the vineyard and would have. Sorry about my typo in my slide. I just saw that. So this man who has planted a vineyard has come into land that is far removed from him, and how does that happen in the first century? Why is Jesus telling a story about this as he's in the temple in Jerusalem, the week of Passover? Like, why is he telling that story? He's telling that story because this was a real thing that happened to people. They had to give up the deed to their land because they couldn't afford the taxes. And so this is how you pay the taxes, by handing over your land. A very real moment for people that's not just that very much happened. It's a real thing that people were faced with, right? So instead of it being, this is a story about God and how God is interacting with God's people, Jesus is telling a story that all the people there have heard of, or they know someone it happened to, or it's even happened to them. So different, right? To make it spiritual versus economic reality. Okay. And so then the vineyard that is planted, then people through the traditional spiritualized lens say, oh, this is the covenant with God that God has established. I can't decide if it's easier to go through like one whole version and then the other, but I'm doing it this way this time. So that the vineyard is the covenant, and then with this economic lens, it's an actual vineyard. It's just the thing that's being talked about, right? So that the first tenants who are working the vineyard then in the story, when you read it spiritually, that would then be the Israelites, who are the ancestors to the Jews, right? And the first tenants in the economic reading is the actual tenants who would have been hired to work the land. And when you look at, historically speaking, and you could apply this to lots of places and times throughout the history of this planet, who are those people going to be, right? Who is nearby who could be hired? And in some cases, it was the people who just had to give up their own land. So they are now being hired to work the land that used to be theirs, but they have to work it in for someone else, right? For someone else's benefit, not for their own. And think about it, right? If you couldn't work the land well enough to feed yourself and then survive and also pay your taxes, how are you now going to work the same land to feed yourself, pay your own taxes, and do all the things, and give a portion to the person who owns the land? Like, this is a spiral of violence that we're talking about that happens in people's lives, right? So the first tenants being the Jews in the traditional or spiritualized interpretation, and the first tenants being the actual people hired to work the land. And again, last week I commented on this fact that grapes, so a vineyard, is a luxury crop, right? It's not wheat, it's not barley, it's not the stuff that you need to survive on a daily basis. So that brings in this other element of elitism and social class issues. So in the metaphorical or spiritual lens, the slaves who are sent to collect, he sends 2 or 3 rounds of slaves to collect. In that spiritual lens, that's seen through the lens of, these are the prophets, the men that God, according to the narrative of the Hebrew Bible, these are the people that God sends to try to get people, to be committed to the covenant and to bring them back to covenant relationship, right? Over and over, you do see that in the Hebrew Bible. And that's for me is a whole nother segment of we need to be very careful about that as well, because most of that that's in the Hebrew Bible is worth challenging, in my opinion, but it's also primarily being directed at the leadership. So the people in positions of power who are being exploitative and are fleecing their own people for their own gain. So there's a direct parallel here that we're actually seeing. But let's keep moving with this. So that in the spiritualized version, right, it's the prophets that God sends to bring people back. In the economic lens, it's actually enslaved people who the people in the temple or the man who's likely affiliated with the temple, that's why he got the deed to the land, right? So enslaved people, who are indebted to him, right? He sends to go collect for him. And then, of course, the next part of the story then, when it says, what shall I do? They've killed, they've killed whoever they keep sending them back empty-handed. And the owner of the vineyard says, what shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him, right? And so, of course, through the now centuries of Christian tradition, God and God's son. I mean, it's an obvious, sending his son Jesus, right? And so that is how it is taught. I remember hearing it taught that way as a child and sitting in church. But in the economic lens, this is an actual son, like this is a man with sending his own servants, enslaved people, and now his son. And then the response in the story, the tenants saw him and said, this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the tenants to others. And so, why would these tenants be saying that? Let's kill the heir. In the historical context, it isn't realistic, but you could see why they might wish for that. They have just had to hand this over, and now if we kill the person to whom the deed would have gone to next after this landowner dies, then maybe we'll get it back, and it doesn't work that way. But that's what's going on in the story. So in the spiritualized version, right, the next tenants would then be the Christians. And I'm pausing because I want to make sure people understand what's being said here. Jesus is quoted saying, attributed with saying, he will come and destroy those tenants, the first tenants, and give the vineyard to others. So from a Christian perspective, or this traditional metaphorical or spiritual lens, the covenant with God will be given to the next set of people, and those first tenants will be killed. That's a genuinely typical rendering of this passage. It's not new. It's been going on for centuries to read it that way. And it says something, right? That there are people who don't blink at that rendering. I remember, so let's finish this, and then I want to share another anecdote real quick. So that when we're reading it from the perspective of how Jesus most likely had he told the story, what he most likely would have been doing is he's saying that this is what happens. This is the cycle of violence that people are forced into. And the people in positions of power don't give a rat's ass about the poor and the people that they're hiring, because they're very easily replaceable, right? So when he will come and destroy and give the vineyard to others, it's very easy to find someone else to replace those tenants we just got rid of somehow. Okay. And of course, the people in the story, respond like, oh my gosh, heaven forbid. Like they know that has happened to their cousin, that happened to them. That is something they saw happen to their neighbors. It's not new. They all know, right? And again, at the end of this passage, which some people didn't really wrestle with, tend not to wrestle with when you're looking at this spiritualized version, is it says the scribes and chief priests realized that he had told the parable against them. So even within the story itself, it's making it pretty clear that this is something he said in the temple, right? He's there for the week of Passover. He's angry about all the things that are going on. He's angry about the way the people in the temple have been kind of hijacked into exploiting their own people. There's meant to be the high priests and these, political leaders and the religious leaders of the people who could be trusted and who could be trusted to live a covenantal life, right? Which is about taking care of each other. And they're doing the opposite. And they're doing what lots of people in power before them within their tradition and around the world have done, right? So this to me was one of those huge, like, oh gosh, that makes so much more sense. I don't have to make God out to be someone who would kill people. And it very much raises for people how common it is for Christians to be taught to tolerate hatred towards Jews, because people will embrace this metaphorical or spiritualized version and interpretation, and will just kind of try to sweep under the carpet the fact that what's just been implied about the treatment of Jews at the hands of their own God, for goodness sakes, right? I mean, it's huge. It's huge that people are still being taught this, right? So I find it a much more compelling story when read through the lenses of, oh, this is a story being told by Jesus because the masses who are gathering in the temple are dealing with this issue, right? And they know about this issue. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and bring this question in because it's a good question instead of waiting until later. It's a funny question how it's been interpreted. Or it's funny how it's been interpreted. If Jesus actually said that, well, he was a Jew. How could he be talking about the Jews? This feels like a later addition. So I hope you're not embarrassed that I've brought your comment or your question up, because I think it's really important. I agree with you, right? There's no way for Jesus to be making a comment like that about his own people, right? Absolutely spot on. But here's the thing that's important about your comment, and then therefore why I wanted to comment on it and talk about this, is for close to 2 millennia, Christians have been teaching that the true trajectory of Judaism is with Christianity. What started out as a segment of Judaism and broke off essentially because it was so contrary. The basic tenets were too contrary to traditional Judaism, to most of the way Jews understood their tradition, which is just honest. And so what is happening here, and has been happening for 1900 years, is that people within the Christian tradition are being taught to think of Jesus as a different kind of a Jew than he actually was, right? And not to see him as, it's why it's actually just in the last 20 to 30 years been controversial to try to get Christians to acknowledge that Jesus was a Jew. Like, truly, it's been a thing to do that, right? So Christians have been taught to see Jesus being prophetic in this moment, right? He's talking through this traditional interpretation. He's talking about how God had a covenant with our people, and they've just consistently been disregarded its truthfulness and its whatever. And God has tried to pull them back, bring them back into covenant relationship with him, but they just keep blowing it off and keep being rude and dismissive and worshiping other gods. So they've sent me now, his son, to rectify the problem. And those people are going to kill me, the son. And that's part of the plan, is to have this all happen. And there's going to be a new tradition. There's going to be a new people of God with the covenant, and it's going to go to them. And so it's not in the way that the Christian tradition has developed and even, I could say, originated, but it then has developed quite quickly within the first 100 years. All these layers, all these pieces of, dismissing Judaism and, standing on the shoulders of that tradition, but also denigrating that tradition. That started happening immediately, like by the end of the first century, right? So within 30, 60 years of Jesus's death, let's just posit that there was that person, right? All these layers of redirecting people's ideas, right, start to take place. So thank you for that comment, because it is actually very important to try to I'm interested in you all understanding what's happening here and understanding how these texts are used to keep people from seeing this hatred and animosity, right? The fact that people are numb, genuinely numb. Christians tend to be numb to what the implications are in the traditional handling, because they've been the recipient of this new covenant, and it's ours. We have the correct understanding, and we're the people of God, and the Jews kind of blew it, and they've just never gotten on board with the real trajectory of the covenant with God. Like, that's how it's kind of talked about and handled, and people are really genuinely numb to all of the backsides of those claims, right? So that's why I'm Indeed, James. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with this. So now I want to go to a different story for today. And so let's look at this one. I'm going to read through it first, and then we'll walk through the slides on this. So what we read last week was chapter 20 of Luke, verses 9 to 19. And then I read the segment after that. And then there's a really interesting story about Sadducees who do not believe in the resurrection coming to question Jesus. And that's one of my favorite passages to talk about in terms of raising questions about what the Bible says about marriage. Because, well, let me just read it really quickly. I can't help myself. Okay, I do need to actually try to keep this under an hour today, but I'm going to go ahead and read it just so I can keep. Oh gosh. Yeah. So some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to Jesus and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a woman, my English says wife. I didn't realize I was going to need these today. Where are my English says wife. Okay. Leaving a woman, but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her. And so in the same way, all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose woman will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading today. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they're like angels. La 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 la. It's really interesting because Jesus actually says people who are worthy of the resurrection don't marry. Like, that is so blatantly anti-marriage. It's hilarious. Okay, so we're going to keep moving now because I want to talk about these political ones too. But since it was in the mix, I just thought I would read it very quickly. So he has this la 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 thing about the footstool, which is just a weird thing to me. And right after that, in the hearing of all the people, so he's in the temple in Jerusalem, right? This is the last week of his life. He's saying all kinds of controversial things in the temple, getting everybody's ire, directed at him. So in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. He looked up and saw rich people throwing their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, truly, I tell you, this poor woman, this economically poor woman has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on. And when I read this, I like to say, and her house is next. I also sometimes get quite a bit more angry than that. And Jesus is, and her house is next, right? Like, this is not fair, right? So I don't know about you all, but I'm guessing many of you here heard the traditional version, and I don't even know. So let me back up just briefly. In the hearing of all the people, beware of the scribes who like to walk around, they devour widows' houses. So what does that mean? It's not a piece that I heard people preaching on or whatever, but it's important because what does that even mean? What's that a reference to, right? They're not actually termites, right? They're devouring widows' houses. This is one of the reasons why the widows, the orphans, and the poor are mentioned over and over again in terms of the people who need to be taken care of in a heavily patriarchal society, right? Where women struggle to be able to survive on their own. It did happen, but it was rare, right? Because of the way everything is set up economically to force them to need to have a man in their life to survive. So you have a widow who is poor. It's almost a redundancy, right? What's going on here, right? How does a widow pay the taxes? What does she do when she can't pay the taxes? She hands over the deed to her house. That's what she does, right? And so it's no small thing to me that's what he lists that in the middle of these things, right? They like to walk around essentially in really luxurious, expensive robes, right? Being seen, being greeted with respect in the marketplaces, have the best seats in the synagogue. Just think about, translate it to whatever thing you've been to in the past, right? In the places of honor, banquets, they devour widows' houses. You could compare this to, I think it's fair to compare this to things like money managers or like people who work on Wall Street, right? Do you see what I'm saying though when I do that? And they, for the sake of appearance, say long prayers, say really impressive, nice things in public, right? They will receive the greater condemnation. And then he's making this comment about these people. And then he looks up and sees in action what he's just commented on, right? That's how this is playing out in the narrative. He sees rich people throwing their gifts into the treasury. And then he sees a poor widow throw in her last 2 thin coins. And he's angry. I think we should be reading this. He's angry. And I'd never heard it read that way, right? I always just heard it with, truly, I tell you, this poor woman's put in more than all of them. Okay. So what I normally hear about this, the gifts into the treasury, so the rich people giving gifts to the treasury, I normally hear this story brought out at the point in time when people are trying to do some sort of trying to drum up more donations to the church, right? And that people will talk about the rich giving out of their abundance. It's not a big deal if you have a lot of assets and money. It's not a big deal to give. And yet we should all be taking the example of this poor woman, right? And it's always couched in terms of she was trusting God with her last 2 cents that God would somehow provide for her. And look what she does, and Jesus commends her for her great faith, right? That she has, look at what she's done. And when you read this with a monotone voice, right? Truly, I tell you, this poor woman has put in more than all of them, for all of them contribute out of their excess, but out of her poverty, she's put in all she had to live on. And the story just moves on, right? So if you don't know the economic context, if you don't understand that he's angry, that's like the primary thing on his, like his stump speech, like what he stands for is addressing the economic exploitation of the masses, and in particular, the widows, the orphans, and the poor. So you need to know to read this. Truly, I tell you, this poor woman, and let's say widow, which is funny because it's actually in the Greek. I just made sure. Yeah, no, he's talking about just poor person. This poor person has put in more than else. Does this sound like familiar? Does this remind you all of anything? Like, I just keep thinking about the taxation system in the United States and how billionaires, there are some people in middle class who pay more taxes than billionaires do. Like, what the right? And so that's what's going, like, that anger. Like, go watch some Rob Reich or Sanders on this and get all worked up, right? That's what we're talking about. All of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she was forced to give the last that she had to live on, and how they're going for her house next. That's what we should be hearing. That's right. That's what's going on here. Okay. And yeah, how many people, people will, televangelists, all of those kinds of folks, right, will come in with this, be like the poor woman who trusted God even with her last 2 pennies, and making that sound all nicey nice instead of it being like this pinnacle moment of anger and frustration. You just did your taxes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this. And so I'm just curious. Are there any questions? We can do another story. We can keep reading because there are more, and I will do that if we have time. Happy to. But I wanted to see if there are any questions at this point about what we've just been talking about what I've just been looking at. And if there aren't, I will go read about Zacchaeus. So let's see. I hope you're comfortable with this, by the way. So it's a change the system message, not a simple let's do some charity work for this one poor lady. Right. She stands as this example of what's being done to poor people or widows, as well as just the masses who are poor. This moment in contrast to, this contrasting situation of the donations or the gifts. I think I was trying to look into the Greek here, the rich are throwing their gifts into the collection plate, right? And this poor woman is throwing her last 2 coins. And so the contrast, yes, is a a jumping off point or a springboard into talking about the system, right? The system that is exploitative, the system that is unjust in terms of what is requiring of people to give to the temple. And that is being, so again, perhaps not everyone has heard all of these things or knows all these things, but in the year 6 Common Era, the Romans decided to piggyback on what they saw happening, which is that they noticed that a lot of Jews go to Jerusalem once a year during Passover. And so why don't we just ask the religious leaders to collect taxes for us and make it a lot easier for us, right? And then for those who don't travel to Jerusalem, we'll send tax collectors to go get to, but we'll hire Jewish people to do that. Yeah. So we have all that. We have there's a whole new layer, in my opinion, to this issue of the interactions between Jesus and tax collectors, for instance, than simply nobody wants to pay taxes. It's bigger than just that, right? The Romans have co-opted the Jewish leadership into being their collectors, their tax collectors, and the Jewish leadership, as many people do in such positions. So this isn't me just throwing Jewish people under the bus. This is about positions of power and exploitation of power. Exploited that. And so anyone who's associated with the temple is going to benefit from that exploitative system. Right. And so all the pieces in play there. It's not so the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, anyone associated with the temple is going to have some sort of trickle down effect. They're going to benefit from that, the way that plays out. So yes, this is not about a charity issue. This is about systemic injustice that is highlighted, right? This moment highlights the frustration for him. Yeah. Thank you for that comment or question asking for clarification. You're welcome, Kyle. Any other questions? I think I'm seeing a question here. I always love an anti-imperial message. Me too. But it took me doing, post-colonial research and reading theory to be able to see that in these texts, KAC in the house. I never understood why the organization of the church was put forward as Jesus's will. Doesn't this mean Jesus was against the organized power abuse? Yes, absolutely. This is why it's this bizarre and powerful thing. The thing that got let me see if I can say this succinctly so I can pull it as a short later. I mean, this is how important your question and comment is, okay? The thing that got Jesus killed was his frustration at the abuse of power and the exploitation of his own people. That's what got him killed. I'm not going to say it right. Let me think this through again. Let me think it through. It's not going to be beautiful, so I'll just chit chat about it. The fact that Jesus is executed by the Roman Empire because he was trying to call them and the Jewish leadership out on their exploitation ought to be really stunningly ironic, right? Given the way the church has developed and the fact that Paul then comes along and takes the guy's death, not what Jesus stood for, right? And used it to create a whole new sect of Judaism. I mean, there's so many pieces to this in terms of the origins of Christianity. Paul did not care about, or perhaps, no, I think it's even bigger than that. Paul himself was implicated in Jesus's anger and frustration because Paul was associated with the temple. I mean, Paul went after Jesus's disciples for a reason. Right? Paul created what became Christianity by focusing on Jesus's execution and making that a thing about resurrection and connection to an afterlife element. Jesus was killed for political and economic reasons, entirely entirely different planet than this issue of a spiritual salvation after death. I mean, they're just on two different planes. How in the world does the Roman Empire embrace Christianity as their religion? They do it because of the spiritualized message that people started to apply to passages like this one, as well as the fact that the primary focus within Paul's comments, Paul's theology, Paul's ideas, the primary focus is on the atonement of sin through a death and carrying that out through this execution of a Jew. Totally irrelevant to Paul what Jesus actually stood for, what Jesus actually preached about, what Jesus was talking about. If Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God is at hand, what Jesus means is a just government is about to descend from the heavens and wipe out this horrific Roman government and start anew. Like the kingdom of heaven for Jesus would have been a place where people were treated properly and justly. And it's about this life, this earth, right? Here and now. No more of this economic exploitation, no more of this ridiculous, like control of us, our ability to have access to resources and all the things that are still at work today, by the way. He was angry about the way people were being treated, and he was seeing it through the lens of his Jewish, tradition, right? Paul is not doing anything at all like that when he takes the execution of this man and turns it into the means for salvation for the Gentiles. I mean, they're not even related. It's just wild. Just wild. Oh, there we go. I didn't mean to do that, but we got a little bubble. Okay. Thank you, Nitty, for the comment. To make sure to like and subscribe and click the bell for notifications so that you'll get a little notification when I'm going live. Thank you for that. I appreciate your support. Thank you. And let's see. What got him killed is a very complex matter. I mean, it is, James, I agree. And yet it's not really. I think that's what's so interesting is, yeah, let's see what time it is. Let's see how far we get here. I'm going to go back to Zacchaeus. Am I missing any really important? Let's see how far we can get. I'm going to go back to Luke chapter 19. So this is the last story kind of as he goes into Jerusalem. And so the story about Zacchaeus is happening in Jericho, which if you go Google a map of the Newer Testament or whatever, Jericho is just northeast of Jerusalem. So like this is how he would have been coming down, from Galilee region down to Jerusalem. What have you gone through? One of the main routes is through Jericho, and it's not far from Jerusalem. And so keep in mind what we just talked about. Everyone associated with the temple would be benefiting from this over taxation and unjust form of taxation, right? And so when we get to Luke chapter 19, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And that's one of the most humorous redundancies in the Bible, right? He's a chief tax collector and was rich. Well, of course he was. But let's be clear about the elements that are being critiqued here, right? Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was. And you might want to think about that differently now, right? Why would a chief tax collector, what's going on there for a chief tax collector having heard about this guy, Jesus? The message of the kingdom of God, or the message of however of the good news, is about relief from this overtaxation, right? So Jesus is coming through town. Zacchaeus wants to see him. Let's think about that differently, perhaps. At least I needed to start thinking about it differently than the way I grew up thinking about that, right? But on account of the crowd, he could not see because he's short and such. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree. And I love the way that like Sunday school lessons and all focus on his height and the tree instead of on the economic exploitation element here. When Jesus came to the place where Zacchaeus was hanging out in the tree, he looked up and said to him, now think about this for a minute. Jesus knows who Zacchaeus is. This is, and again, I remember thinking about this through the lens of Jesus is God, so he knows all things, right? And so of course he sensed this guy's presence, or knew him and knew who he was, because God sees and knows all things and sees right into your heart and soul through your eyes or whatever. No. Jesus knew who Zacchaeus was, right? One of the primary players in his issue, right? So when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and was like, Zacchaeus, come on down, hurry up. I must stay at your house today. So think about that. Do whatever analogy you need to make it more realistic for you. Are there current parallels we could think of that would help you to see, the union leader wants to meet with the president or whoever of the company that is resisting allowing a unionization or whatever, however you want to translate that into terms that work for you. I think that's helpful, because to have Jesus, who has been traveling around getting people worked up and excited about this idea of justice, economic justice. And he's traveling through town and he stops specifically to talk with Zacchaeus. Like, what is that about? And I've had people say things like, well, you just wanted one really nice last meal before you went to Jerusalem to die. I'm like, I like that. I like that. That's good. Did he want to know who the power players were in Jerusalem that he should be targeting and like being, like, talk to me about who's in there and I'm going to, just so I know who I want to make sure I piss off when I get there. Like, why does he want to meet with Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector, one of the primary players in the issue that Jesus is about to be killed for challenging? Right? He knows he's going to be that, that's the other thing. Of course, he knows he's about to be killed because he's going to take this message of injustice to the people who are inflicting it. And you don't speak truth to power and survive it. You just don't. This is one of the truths of this story about Jesus. Speaking truth to power that is being, right, exploitative, that is taking advantage, that is unjust, unfair, isn't hearing the voices of the poor, isn't treating humans like humans. Like, when you try to speak against that, you get squashed one way or another. Just did a little soapbox issue there. Okay. Hurry up and come down. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. Zacchaeus was happy to welcome Jesus. Isn't that interesting? So Zacchaeus, this is another thing that I think about a lot. People who are well off financially have a lot of space in their mind and in their energy to entertain these kinds of things. When you are strapped and living paycheck to paycheck, or right, you don't have room to just play around with free time. You don't have that emotional space. You're exhausted, you're worn thin. But when you're well off, you can entertain some ideas and people and possibilities, and they're not necessary. You don't have to take them seriously. You don't have to be affected by it. But you could have a conversation just because you're curious. Doesn't mean you're going to change. Doesn't mean you're going to do anything about it. But boy, you get all the time in the world. You can do that. I hope I'm making sense here. But anyway, he hurried down, and all who saw this were like, what? He's gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner, the one who is causing our problems. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, you missed this in the Greek. He actually stands up, which perhaps implies at the end of the day, at the end of their conversation or whatever. He stood up and said, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. And I've read other scholars who comment on that 4 times as much, not literally, but it gives a nod to the way indebtedness plays out for people, so that when you are in debt and when the interest rate is high enough, which there are evidence of very high interest rates, 50%, 100%, you don't ever get out of that. And so this idea of paying back 4 times what was owed or what was given, stolen, that's a nod to very real life issues for people. And then what Jesus says, and this is the thing that I wrote about this. This was the first passage I did an exegesis paper on in seminary. I had just taken Greek intensively over the summer, and then I took an exegesis course that fall. And for whatever reason, I chose to write on this passage. And this line, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. Okay, there are all kinds of things that are going on in terms of the difference between if a guy named Jesus kind of actually said this versus how now it's being attributed to him several, decades later. But the key that I think is relevant and is powerful is this: the way that salvation is defined in the Gospel of Luke is demonstrated here. It's set, the stage is set for it at the very beginning of the Gospel, that salvation is about fixing the problems in this life, on this planet, here and now. And so to say that salvation has come to this house is to say that the man of the house is going to change his ways. He's going to rectify the problems that he's caused or contributed to, right? He's going to address these things. That is what salvation actually is in the Gospel of Luke. It's not about, getting into heaven. It's about justice here on earth in our lifetime. And I didn't see that, and I couldn't see that as a very still evangelical Christian when I took that course. And I wrestled with it all semester. I was very confused, did not understand how that worked. And I'm not sure my professor did either. I'm not sure I got much help with it from my TA or my professor on that, because they were both very conservative evangelicals as well. Anyway, I think this is actually quite helpful, right, in terms of understanding what we're talking about. The Zacchaeus story, for me, makes so much more sense when I read it through economic lens. This kind of economic lens, and not the one that I had always thought of it through. So, it's an interesting question. Would Zacchaeus have been at least a couple steps removed from calling the shots? Perhaps, yeah. I think that's fair. He's the chief priest, or the chief tax collector, so he's in tight. He's in tight with the people in the temple, right? And he's kind of in the suburbs of Jerusalem, in a sense. I mean, it's a little farther than that, but like that's being in Jericho, right? It's an important city. It's not Jerusalem, but it's a city. It's important, and he's running things. Chief tax collector. Yeah, there are probably more than one chief tax collector. But yeah, right. He's not the top of the hierarchy entirely. That would be the chief priests and the the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and perhaps even the scribes. Yep. Let's see. Yeah, well, Jesus looking for collaborators, or was Jesus, wondering who he should focus his attention on? You could even, I think, entertain the idea that he's like, all right, if I wanted to get a hearing with the people running the show, who do I need to know? Who do I need to talk to? Who can help me get a hearing? Like, who can I, how do I get a hearing with these people? Which then, in a very kind of interesting way, plays into what is, I think, a more reasonable reading of Judas and Judas's role in the story, which is to see Judas's motivation through the lens of this economic issue and seeing if we can get some of the leaders to come around to hearing what's going on. Like, if I can get Jesus in the room with them, maybe he can convince them, or, if they hear the issue from our perspective, if they can hear us, if they can hear the leader of this movement, they might understand it differently or whatever, instead of excuse me, instead of just seeing it through the lens of Judas was a betrayer. That's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. I am I have to be honest, I'm such a fan of Shelby Spong. These people don't truly believe, instead they believe and believe. I had a brief exchange with John Spong before he died, not long before he died, actually. I'd sent him a copy of my book, Permission Granted, and he sent me a really lovely note in response, telling me to keep up the good work. It's one of the few notes I've kept over the years. So I need to go. I have another meeting to get to. I'm really grateful that you all were here chit-chatting with each other and with me when I could pay attention. Thank you for being here live. If you were able to and wanted to be here, thank you for watching later. I am so grateful for the ways that you all support me by doing this, by showing up, by reminding me to suggest that you all like and hit subscribe and even hit the bell for notifications, the way that you all pass along links of your favorite videos or shorts to other people, the way you help me spread the word about what I'm doing that way, and the way you support me financially in the various ways that you can, including my Patreon page, which, oh my gosh, I almost forgot. I meant to leave myself a note. I'm going to start doing on the third Thursday of the month, starting in February. I'm going to do a live conversation. So I'll send out a Zoom link to everyone who sponsors me financially through Patreon. So even at just the bread and butter level. So I'm excited to do that, to see if there's some things that you all want me to do, or what kinds of conversations we can get up to here or there. I have all kinds of thoughts and ideas, and I want to see what people are interested in. So I'm excited to do that. Start doing that in a couple weeks. Or next week. Huh. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you just thank you. I appreciate you all. And I will see you all next week for a live stream at 3 o'clock Eastern.